The Sterling Room was the kind of restaurant where billionaires dined and careers ended with a single complaint, and tonight the staff whispered in fear because Evelyn Cross was coming. The CEO, whose displeasure had destroyed lives with nothing more than a phone call. But when Clara Mitchell was assigned to her table, nobody knew the quiet waitress had once worked in financial compliance, that she could recognize the patterns hidden in billing systems, and when a single flag appeared on her screen during Evelyn's dinner, Clara had to choose between deleting it like everyone expected or standing up to the most powerful woman in the city, because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one with all the power. It's the one who refuses to be afraid of it. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The kitchen doors swung open, releasing a burst of heat and the clatter of plates, but the conversation among the wait staff stopped cold. Someone had just said her name, Evelyn Cross. Clara Mitchell wiped down a wine glass, pretending not to listen, but the tension in the room was impossible to ignore. The other servers huddled near the reservation podium, their voices dropping to urgent whispers. "She's coming tonight," Marcus, one of the senior waiters, said. He'd been working at the Sterling Room for 12 years, longer than anyone else. 7 o'clock reservation. Private dining room. "Who got assigned?" someone asked. Marcus shook his head. "Nobody's volunteered yet." Clara glanced up from her station. She'd heard stories about Evelyn Cross since her first day at the restaurant 3 months ago. The billionaire CEO who could end careers with a phone call. The woman who'd gotten an entire catering company shut down because the appetizers arrived 6 minutes late. The investor whose displeasure had cost people their livelihoods. "What happened last time she was here?" Clara asked. The room went quiet. Marcus exchanged looks with another server, a woman named Beth who'd been there almost as long. "Last time," Beth said slowly, she sent back a bottle of wine because the temperature was half a degree off. The sommelier tried to explain it was within acceptable range. She had him fired before dessert arrived. "The restaurant fought it," Marcus added. "Try to keep him on." She threatened to pull her company's corporate account. "They do $250,000 in business here every year." He was gone by morning. Clara set down glass. "That's insane." "That's Evelyn Cross," Beth said. "She doesn't just complain. She destroys. There's a chef in Boston who can't get hired anywhere decent because she told people he gave her food poisoning. Health inspectors found nothing wrong, but it didn't matter. Her word was enough." The restaurant manager, Gerald, emerged from his office. His face was pale, and he carried himself like a man walking to his own execution. He'd been on the phone for the last 20 minutes, and everyone knew who he'd been talking to. "Listen up," Gerald said, his voice tight. "Miss Cross will be here in 40 minutes. This is a high-profile investor dinner. Everything needs to be perfect. And I mean perfect. Timing, presentation, temperature, everything." "Who's taking the table?" Marcus asked. Gerald's eyes swept the room. The senior servers suddenly found reasons to look elsewhere. One checked his watch. Another pretended to study the reservation book. "Clara," Gerald said. Her stomach dropped. "Me? You're capable. You've handled difficult tables before." "Gerald, I've been here 3 months. There are people with years more experience, who are all conveniently busy with other sections tonight," Gerald interrupted. His tone made it clear this wasn't a discussion. "You'll be fine. Just follow protocol. Be invisible. Anticipate needs before she voices them. And whatever you do, don't give her a reason to notice you." Clara wanted to argue, but the fear in Gerald's eyes stopped her. This wasn't just about keeping a customer happy. This was about survival. 40 minutes later, Clara stood in the private dining room, checking the table settings for the 3rd time. The silverware gleamed under soft lighting. Wine glasses caught the light like crystal sculptures. Everything was positioned exactly according to the Sterling Room's exacting standards. The door opened, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Evelyn Cross entered like royalty, inspecting a newly conquered territory. She was tall, with sharp features and dark hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful. Her black suit probably cost more than Clara made in 6 months. But it wasn't her appearance that commanded attention. It was the way she moved, the way she looked at everything as if calculating its worth and finding it barely acceptable. Behind her came four men in expensive suits, all middle-aged, all carrying the quiet confidence of wealth. But next to Evelyn, they looked like nervous students hoping not to disappoint their professor. "Miss Cross." Gerald appeared at Clara's elbow, his smile bright and desperate. "Welcome back to the Sterling Room. We're honored to host your dinner this evening." Evelyn didn't acknowledge him. Her eyes swept the room, pausing on each detail: the flowers, the lighting, the table setting. Finally, she looked at Gerald. "The temperature is too warm," she said. Her voice was cold, precise. "Adjust it. Now." "Of course, right away." Gerald practically ran from the room. Evelyn took her seat at the head of the table, and the investors arranged themselves around her like satellites orbiting a planet. Clara approached with water, her hands steady despite her racing heart. "Good evening. May I start you with?" "We'll need wine immediately," Evelyn interrupted, not looking at her. "The 2015 Chateau Margaux. Decanted properly. Not the rushed job you typically do for tables that don't matter." "Yes, ma'am." Clara turned to leave, but Evelyn's voice stopped her. "And the menu descriptions on your system are wrong. The sea base is listed as Mediterranean preparation. It's actually prepared Provençal style. Fix it before someone embarrassed themselves trying to explain it to me." One of the investors, a heavy-set man with graying temples, cleared his throat. "Evelyn, I was thinking about the Portland acquisition." "Not yet, Richard," Evelyn said, her attention still on her phone. "We'll discuss business after I've established that this restaurant can handle basic competence." Richard fell silent. The other investors exchanged glances but said nothing. Clara returned with the wine, decanted and perfect. She poured a small amount for Evelyn to taste, her movements practiced and smooth. Evelyn lifted the glass, swirled it once, and took a sip. She set it down without comment, which Clara had learned was the closest thing to approval Evelyn Cross offered. "We're ready to order," Evelyn announced, though Clara hadn't asked. "I'll have the Dover sole. Confirm with the kitchen that it's the North Sea sole, not the farm garbage. Vegetables steamed, no butter, no oil. If there's so much as a drop of fat on that plate, someone will regret it." Clara wrote quickly, then turned to the investors. They ordered nervously, glancing at Evelyn between selections as if seeking permission. When Clara returned to the service station to enter the orders, she noticed something odd on her screen. As she input Evelyn's meal, an automatic tag appeared in the billing system, a small notation she recognized from her previous job. Clara had worked in compliance for a financial services firm before it collapsed 2 years ago. She'd been junior staff, processing documentation and flagging irregularities. The company had imploded after an investigation revealed systematic fraud, and everyone lost their jobs. Clara had spent 18 months struggling to find work before landing at the Sterling Room. But she remembered the systems. She remembered the tags. This particular tag indicated corporate billing, routed through shell company structures. It was the kind of thing that appeared when transactions were designed to bypass standard reporting. Clara had seen it dozens of times in her old job, usually right before auditors got very interested. She stared at the screen. The tag shouldn't be there. This was supposed to be a straightforward business dinner, charged to a corporate account. There was no reason for the routing to trigger compliance flags, unless the account itself was structured to hide something. Clara's finger hovered over the keyboard. She could override it. It would take 10 seconds, and no one would ever know. The dinner would proceed normally. Evelyn would leave satisfied, and Clara would keep her job. But she'd seen where ignored flags led. She'd watched her entire former company crumble because people had overridden warnings just like this one. Problem. Clara jumped. Gerald stood behind her, his expression anxious. "No, just, there's an automatic corporate billing tag. It's routing through a secondary structure." Gerald's face paled. "Can you fix it?" "I can't override it without authorization. It's built into the system to prevent." "Clara." Gerald's voice dropped to a harsh whisper. "That is Evelyn Cross in there. She does not hear the word can't. Figure it out." "Gerald, this kind of tag triggers audit trails. If I override it without proper authorization, it creates a documented violation. The system is designed to." "I don't care what the system is designed to do," Gerald hissed. I care about keeping this restaurant running. Do you understand what happens if she leaves unhappy? Do you understand what she can do to us? Clara looked at the screen, then back at Gerald. I understand. But I also understand what happens when compliance flags get ignored. I've lived through it. She turned back to her terminal and finalized the order without touching the flag. The tag remained bright and unmistakable in the billing code. Gerald stared at her, disbelief and fury warring in his expression. Then he turned and walked away without another word. The dinner proceeded smoothly for the next hour. Clara moved through her duties with mechanical precision, refilling water glasses, clearing plates, responding to requests with quiet efficiency. At the table, Evelyn dominated the conversation, dissecting business proposals with surgical precision while the investors tried to keep pace. The Portland facility is underperforming, Evelyn said, cutting into her soul. We'll restructure or sell within the quarter. Richard, I want the analysis on my desk Monday morning. Of course, but the union contracts are not my concern, Evelyn interrupted. Make it work, or I'll find someone who can. Richard nodded, his face carefully blank. Clara brought dessert menus, setting them down silently. Evelyn didn't glance at hers. We won't be having dessert, she announced. Bring the bill. Clara returned to her terminal, her heart pounding. The bill generated automatically, the flag tag still present, now incorporated into the final total. She printed it, placed it in the leather portfolio, and carried it to the table. Evelyn opened it, her eyes scanning the itemized charges. Then she stopped. Her expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air. The investors sensed it too, their conversations trailing off into uncomfortable silence. What? Evelyn said slowly, her voice dropping to something dangerous. Is this? She jabbed a finger at a line item on the bill. Clara stepped closer, though every instinct screamed at her to run. That's the corporate billing charge, ma'am. It's automatically generated based on the account routing. I can read what it says. Evelyn's voice rose. What I want to know is why it's there. This dinner is supposed to be billed to my company's standard corporate account. This line item suggests secondary routing. Yes, ma'am. The system flagged the account structure and generated the charge automatically. It's designed to. I don't care what it's designed to do. Evelyn stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. The sound echoed in the suddenly silent room. This is incompetence. This is amateur hour nonsense that should never appear on a bill presented to me. The investors sat frozen, their faces carefully neutral. But Clara saw their eyes flicking between Evelyn and the bill, saw the calculations happening behind their polite masks. Fix it, Evelyn demanded. Remove this charge immediately. Clara forced herself to stay calm. I'm sorry, ma'am, but I can't remove it. The charge was generated automatically based on the account coding. It requires authorization to override. Then get authorization. The system doesn't allow manual overrides for flag transactions. It's built that way to prevent. Are you telling me no? Evelyn's voice was ice. Are you actually standing here, telling me that you refuse to fix your own mistake? It's not a mistake, ma'am. Clara kept her voice steady, professional. The charge appears because your account is routed through structures that trigger reporting requirements. Even if I wanted to remove it, the system won't allow it without creating an audit trail. The room fell absolutely silent. One of the investors, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, leaned forward slightly, his attention suddenly sharp. Another exchanged a quick glance with Richard. They'd heard what Clara said. They understood the implications. Evelyn's face flushed with fury. Do you have any idea who I am? Do you understand what I can do to you? To this restaurant? I will have you fired. I will make sure you never work in this industry again. I will personally ensure that every establishment in this city knows your name and why you should never be employed. I understand you're upset, ma'am, but the billing system. Give me a manager. Now. Clara nodded and walked calmly from the room, though her legs felt weak. She found Gerald in the hallway, already pale. He'd clearly heard the shouting. She wants to speak with you, Clara said quietly. Gerald closed his eyes briefly, gathering himself, then walked toward the private dining room like a condemned man. Clara followed at a distance, hovering near the doorway. Gerald. Evelyn's voice carried into the hallway. Your waitress has decided that customer service is optional. Fix this billing error immediately, or I'll make one phone call that ends this restaurant's relationship with every corporate client you have. Gerald's voice was placating, desperate. Miss Cross, I apologize for any confusion. Let me look at this, and I'm sure we can. He stopped. Clara knew he was looking at the bill, seeing the same flag she'd seen. This charge, Gerald said slowly, is automatically generated. It's part of our compliance system. I don't have the authority to override it without. Without what? Evelyn demanded. Without triggering an audit trail that gets reported to financial oversight, Gerald finished, his voice barely audible. The silence that followed was suffocating. Are you telling me, Evelyn said, each word precisely enunciated, that this restaurant's billing system is designed to flag legitimate corporate accounts as suspicious? Not suspicious, ma'am. Just structured in a way that requires documentation. Richard stood up carefully. Evelyn, perhaps we should. Sit down, Richard. Evelyn's eyes never left Gerald. I want this fixed. I want this charge removed. I want an apology. And I want that waitress fired before I leave this building. Gerald opened his mouth, but no words came out. Clara could see him calculating, weighing years of careful relationship building against the reality of what the bill represented. I can't override the system, Gerald finally said. Even if I wanted to, the tag is automatic. It's built into our financial software specifically to create documentation. If I bypass it manually, it generates a report that goes directly to our corporate office and, depending on the amount, potentially to regulators. The investor with wire-rimmed glasses stood slowly. Evelyn, I think I should be going. I have an early meeting tomorrow. Sit down, Thomas. But Thomas was already gathering his coat. I'll be in touch next week. He nodded to the others and left quickly, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Evelyn turned back to Gerald, her face a mask of controlled rage. You're making a very serious mistake. I'm following the law, Miss Cross. The law, Evelyn repeated, her voice dripping with contempt. She turned to the remaining investors. Gentlemen, it seems we've been subjected to treatment more appropriate for criminals than valued customers. I suggest we take our business elsewhere. She swept from the room, the investors hurrying after her. As they passed Clara in the hallway, she heard Richard mutter to another man. Did you hear what that flag was for? Shell company routing. Why would her account trigger that? They disappeared through the restaurant's main entrance, leaving silence in their wake. Gerald turned to Clara. His face was ashen, his hands shaking. Do you understand what you've done? He asked quietly. I processed the bill according to the system requirements. You embarrassed the most powerful woman in this city. You made her look suspicious in front of her investors. She'll destroy this restaurant. She'll destroy all of us. Clara met his eyes. The flag was already there, Gerald. I didn't create it. The system did because the account structure triggered automatic compliance protocols. All I did was refuse to hide it. That's not how she'll see it. Maybe not, Clara agreed. But it's the truth. Gerald walked away without responding, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Clara returned to the now empty private dining room. The table was a mess of half-finished drinks and crumpled napkins. She began clearing plates, her movements automatic. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying the moment she'd seen that flag appear on her screen. She'd spent 2 years trying to forget her old job, trying to forget the feeling of watching everything collapse because people had ignored warnings that seemed inconvenient. She'd sworn she wouldn't be part of that again, even if it cost her everything. The restaurant closed an hour later. Clara finished her sit-to-work in silence, while the other servers gave her a wide berth, as if disaster might be contagious. Marcus approached as she was counting her tips. That was brave, he said quietly. Or stupid. I'm not sure which. Maybe both, Clara replied. She'll come after you. You know that, right? Evelyn Cross doesn't forget. Clara nodded. She didn't know, but she also knew what happened when people looked the other way because it was easier. She'd lived in that wreckage once before. She wouldn't do it again. As Clara walked to her car that night, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. We need to talk about what you saw tonight. This is important. Clara stared at the message. She didn't respond. Instead, she saved the number and got in her car. Whatever was coming, she'd face it standing up. She'd already decided that the moment she refused to delete that flag, some lines couldn't be uncrossed, no matter how much power stood on the other side. Clara's refusal to remove the billing flag had created a crack in Evelyn Cross's carefully constructed world. As the private dining room emptied and the restaurant closed for the night, that crack began to spread in ways neither woman could have anticipated. By midnight, the story had already reached 3 different private clubs in the city, not through social media or news outlets, but through the quiet channels where real power communicated. Carefully worded phone calls, text messages between board members, hushed conversations in penthouses overlooking the financial district. Thomas Harrington, the investor who'd left Evelyn's dinner early, sat in his study with a glass of scotch and his phone. He'd made 4 calls in the last hour, each to someone he trusted completely. The conversations all followed the same pattern. I was at dinner with Evelyn tonight. Something strange happened with the bill. Corporate routing flag, the kind that triggers compliance documentation. A pause, letting that sink in. The waitress wouldn't override it. Said the system was designed to create an audit trail. Evelyn lost it completely. The responses varied, but the underlying message was consistent. Concern masked as curiosity, questions framed as friendly interest. By morning, 24 of the city's most influential people would know that something about Evelyn Cross's financial structures had triggered automatic fraud detection systems. And in the world of high finance, that kind of knowledge spread like blood in water. Across town, in a modest apartment in a neighborhood Evelyn Cross would never visit, Clara sat at her kitchen table, staring at her laptop. She'd pulled up her old files from her previous job, the one she'd saved before the company collapsed. Spreadsheets full of flagged transactions, compliance reports that had been ignored, documentation of the systematic fraud that eventually brought everything down. She remembered the billing codes. She remembered the patterns. And she remembered what happened when people with power decided that rules didn't apply to them. The text message on her phone still glowed. "We need to talk about what you saw tonight. This is important." Clara had spent 2 hours researching the number. It came back to a law firm specializing in financial litigation. Not the kind that represented billionaires, the kind that went after them. She didn't respond. Not yet. But she didn't delete it either. The next morning, Clara arrived at the Sterling room to find Gerald waiting in his office. His face was gray, his eyes bloodshot. He'd clearly been there all night. "Close the door," he said. Clara did, her stomach sinking. "Miss Cross's attorney called 3 times last night," Gerald began without preamble. "They want you fired immediately. They're also demanding an apology from the restaurant and a full retraction of any implication that her account was improper." "I didn't imply anything," Clara said. "I just processed the bill according to the system." Her attorney sees it differently. They're calling it defamation. Slander. They're threatening to sue you personally and the restaurant corporately if we don't terminate you and issue a public apology. Clara felt her chest tighten. "What did you tell them?" Gerald looked down at his desk. "I told them I needed to consult with our corporate office and our own lawyers. I bought us 24 hours, maybe less." He looked up at her, his expression tortured. "Clara, I don't want to fire you. You do what you thought was right. But this restaurant is my life. The owners are terrified. If Evelyn pulls her corporate account and convinces others to follow, we're looking at losing 30% of our revenue. We won't survive that. So you're going to fire me?" "I don't know yet. Our lawyers are reviewing the billing system documentation. They're trying to determine if you actually had the authority to override that flag or if you were following protocol." He rubbed his face. "But I need you to understand what's at stake here. This isn't just about one bad night. Evelyn Cross doesn't fight fair. She fights to destroy." Clara stood. "I understand. Is there anything else? Don't talk to anyone about this. No media, no social media, nothing. If this becomes a public story, it gets exponentially worse for everyone." Clara nodded and left his office. The other servers were already setting up for lunch service, but the atmosphere was different. People glanced at her, then quickly looked away. Marcus gave her a sympathetic nod, but said nothing. She went through her shift mechanically, taking orders, delivering food, forcing smiles. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying the previous night, analyzing every decision. She'd known refusing to delete that flag would have consequences. She just hadn't imagined they'd come this fast. At a glass tower 20 blocks away, Evelyn Cross sat in her corner office overlooking the city. She'd been awake since 4 in the morning, which wasn't unusual. She rarely slept more than 4 hours. What was unusual was the reason she couldn't sleep. That waitress, that insignificant, nobody waitress had embarrassed her in front of her investors, had made her look suspicious, had treated her like a common criminal rather than the titan she was. Evelyn's assistant, Jennifer, stood before her desk with a tablet, running through the morning's priorities. Your legal team needs a decision on the Sterling Room situation, Jennifer said carefully. They're recommending termination of the waitress and a settlement that includes a non-disparagement clause. Not good enough, Evelyn said flatly. I want her unhireable. I want every restaurant in this city to know what happens when you disrespect me. They're concerned about documentation. Apparently, the billing system she referenced is legitimate. If she was following established protocol. I don't care about protocol. Evelyn's hand slammed on the desk. She made me look like a criminal in front of my investors. Thomas Harrington left in the middle of dinner. Do you understand what that signals? Jennifer nodded carefully. He's called twice this morning. He says he needs to discuss the Portland acquisition timeline. He's stalling. He heard that billing flag, and now he's nervous. Evelyn stood, pacing to the window. Give me everything on that waitress. Employment history, education, references, everything. I want to know who she is and how she knew about compliance flagging systems. Already done. Jennifer pulled up a file on her tablet. Clara Mitchell, 29. Previous employment at Meridian Financial Services before the company collapsed in 2023. She worked in their compliance department as a junior analyst. Evelyn turned sharply. Meridian? The fraud case. Yes. The company was investigated for systematic transaction manipulation. Clara Mitchell was one of dozens of employees who lost their jobs when the company was dissolved. There's no indication she was involved in the fraud itself. She was too junior. But she would have been familiar with compliance systems. Evelyn's mind raced. The waitress hadn't just stumbled onto that billing flag. She'd recognized it. She'd understood what it meant. And she'd refused to ignore it because she'd seen what happened when people did. This changes things, Evelyn said quietly. She's not just some server who got lucky. She knows exactly what she saw. Do you want me to contact legal again? No. I want you to contact Marcus Reed. Tell him I need to see him immediately. Jennifer's expression flickered with surprise. Marcus Reed was Evelyn's lead counsel, the attorney she called when situations required more than standard legal pressure. He was expensive, ruthless, and very good at making problems disappear. Yes, ma'am. Anything else? Cancel my afternoon meetings. I need to think. After Jennifer left, Evelyn returned to the window. Below, the city spread out like a game board, each building representing money, power, influence. She'd built her empire by being smarter and more ruthless than everyone else. She'd created structures that allowed her to move money efficiently, to minimize tax burden, to maximize profit. All perfectly legal, all carefully documented, all designed by the best attorneys money could buy. But those structures relied on people not asking questions, on billing systems processing transactions without flags, on waitresses who didn't have backgrounds in financial compliance. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt something unfamiliar, genuine concern. 3 blocks from Evelyn's office, in a cramped workspace that smelled of coffee and old books, a junior analyst named Kevin Park sat at his desk scrolling through industry news. He worked for a mid-sized compliance consulting firm, the kind that helped companies navigate regulatory requirements without the prestige or pay of the big names. Kevin had heard about the Sterling Room incident from his roommate, who worked as a bartender and had friends in the restaurant scene. The story had seemed unremarkable at first, just another tale of a difficult customer and an unfortunate confrontation. But then his roommate had mentioned the billing flag, corporate routing through secondary structures, automatic compliance documentation. Kevin pulled up his archives from 2 years ago back when he'd been an intern helping with the Meridian financial investigation. He'd spent 6 months reviewing transaction records, learning to recognize the patterns of financial manipulation. He remembered the billing codes, the routing structures, the way legitimate companies disguise questionable transactions by layering them through shell entities. He also remembered seeing those same codes associated with a different company, one that had flagged during the Meridian investigation but had never been formally examined because the case had focused elsewhere. Kevin opened a secure database and ran a search. It took 15 minutes, but he found it, a reference document from the Meridian case listing associated entities that showed similar transaction patterns. One of those entities was a holding company called Crosstech Investments, owned by Evelyn Cross. Kevin sat back in his chair, his heart pounding. The connection wasn't proof of anything illegal. Lots of companies used complex structures for legitimate tax and business purposes. But the fact that Crosstech had appeared in a fraud investigation file, even peripherally, was significant. He picked up his phone and called his supervisor. "Hey, it's Kevin. Remember the Meridian financial case? I think I found something worth looking at." By lunchtime, a copy of the archive document was on its way to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Clara was wiping down tables when her phone buzzed. Another text from the unknown number. "The situation is escalating. You should have legal representation. Call me." This time, Clara responded, "Who is this?" The reply came immediately. "Sarah Chun. I'm an attorney with Brennan and Associates. We specialize in whistleblower protection. What you saw at that restaurant might be bigger than you realize." Clara's hands went cold. Whistleblower protection. That meant this wasn't just about a difficult customer and a billing error. That meant someone believed there was actual wrongdoing involved. She stepped into the back hallway and called the number. Sarah Chun answered on the first ring. "Thank you for calling me back, Ms. Mitchell. I know this situation must be overwhelming. How did you get my number?" "I have contacts in the restaurant industry. When I heard about what happened with Evelyn Cross, I recognized the billing system you described. I've seen similar structures in other cases." "What kind of cases?" "Financial fraud, tax evasion, money laundering. The corporate routing flags you mentioned are designed to catch exactly the kind of shell company structures that facilitate those crimes." Sarah paused. "Ms. Mitchell, can you tell me exactly what you saw on that billing system?" Clara hesitated. Gerald had told her not to talk to anyone, but Gerald was also considering firing her to appease Evelyn Cross. She made a decision. "The system automatically flagged the account with a corporate routing tag," Clara said. "The kind that indicates transactions passing through secondary structures. I recognized it from my previous job at Meridian Financial." She heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath. "You worked at Meridian?" "In compliance, yes. I was junior staff, but I saw those tags every day. I know what they mean." "Ms. Mitchell, I need you to listen to me very carefully. The flag you saw wasn't random. Those systems are sophisticated. If Evelyn Cross's corporate account triggered automatic compliance documentation, it's because the account structure matches known patterns of financial manipulation. That doesn't mean she's doing anything illegal," Clara said, though her voice wavered. "No, it doesn't. But it means someone should look closer. And from what I'm hearing, several people already are." "What do you mean?" "There are whispers. People who were at that dinner are asking questions. Analysts who remember seeing Cross's company's flag before. The SEC has people who notice patterns." Sarah's voice became more urgent. "Evelyn Cross is going to come after you hard. She's going to try to discredit you, intimidate you, maybe even sue you. But if what you saw is legitimate, if that flag was correct, then you're not just a waitress who made a mistake. You're a witness." Clara felt the world tilting beneath her. A witness to what? That's what needs to be determined. But I can help protect you if it comes to that. Whistleblower protections are strong if you follow the right procedures. You don't have to face this alone. Clara closed her eyes. 3 months ago, she'd been serving tables and trying to forget about compliance systems and failed companies. Now she was on the phone with a lawyer discussing whistleblower protection and fraud investigations. "I need to think about this," Clara said. "Of course, but don't wait too long. The people who move first usually control the narrative. And Evelyn Cross is already moving." After hanging up, Clara stood in the empty hallway, her mind spinning. She could walk away, apologize, maybe even get fired, but move on with her life. Find another restaurant, another job, forget this ever happened. But she tried forgetting once before, after Meridian. She tried pretending she hadn't seen what she'd seen, tried convincing herself it wasn't her responsibility. And it had eaten at her for 2 years. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't be able to forget this. The question was whether she'd face it honestly or spend the rest of her life wondering if she'd been complicit in something wrong. Clara returned to the dining room and finished her shift. That evening, she opened her laptop and began documenting everything she remembered from that night. The exact wording on the billing flag, the specific code she'd seen, the way the system had processed the charge. If Sarah Chan was right, someone would eventually ask for this information. And Clara intended to have answers ready. At Evelyn Cross's office, Marcus Reed sat across from her desk reviewing documents. He was 60, gray-haired, and had the predatory calm of someone who'd spent decades destroying people in courtrooms. "The situation is manageable," he said, setting down the papers. "But it requires a specific approach. We can't simply threaten her into silence. Not if she actually understands compliance systems. She'll know her rights." "Then what do you suggest?" Evelyn asked. "We overwhelm her. Personal lawsuit for defamation. Threaten her with court costs she can't afford. Make it clear that fighting will destroy her financially. Most people fold under that kind of pressure. And if she doesn't fold," Marcus hesitated, "then we have a problem. Because if she talks to the right people, if she explains what she saw in detail, it could trigger a formal investigation. The SEC pays attention to patterns, especially involving high-profile individuals." "I haven't done anything illegal," Evelyn said flatly. "I'm not suggesting you have. But complex corporate structures always look suspicious to investigators, even when they're perfectly legal. The appearance of impropriety can be just as damaging as actual impropriety, especially in your position." Evelyn stood and walked to the window again. "I want her gone, Marcus. I want her reputation destroyed. I want her to understand what happens when you challenge me. That could be arranged. But I need to ask you a direct question, Evelyn. Is there anything in your corporate structures that could be problematic if examined by regulators?" "Everything I do is reviewed by attorneys and accountants," Evelyn said. "It's all documented and legal." "That's not what I asked." Evelyn turned to face him. "There's nothing that will survive examination. My structures are complex, but they're legitimate. Anyone who looks will find exactly what they're supposed to find." Marcus nodded slowly. "Then we proceed. I'll draft the lawsuit against Ms. Mitchell and the restaurant. We'll file by end of week." After Marcus left, Evelyn sat alone in her office as the sun set over the city. She built everything through careful planning, strategic risk-taking, and absolute control. She didn't allow variables. She didn't allow uncertainty. But now there was a waitress who understood compliance systems. There were investors asking quiet questions. There were patterns being noticed by people who made their living finding patterns. For the first time in her career, Evelyn Cross couldn't see all the pieces on the board, and that terrified her more than she would ever admit. The next morning, Clara received a certified letter at her apartment. Inside was a formal notice of intent to file a civil lawsuit for defamation, seeking $2 million in damages. The letter detailed how Clara's false and malicious statements about Evelyn Cross's financial accounts had damaged her reputation and business relationships. It demanded a public apology and retraction, along with a signed affidavit stating she had acted inappropriately in refusing to override the billing system. Clara read it 3 times, her hands shaking. Then she picked up her phone and called Sarah Chun. "I got the lawsuit notice," Clara said when the attorney answered. "I was expecting that. Don't panic. It's an intimidation tactic. It's working. I don't have $2 million. I don't have $2,000. They don't expect to collect. They expect you to fold, to apologize, sign whatever they want, and disappear." Sarah's voice became firm. "The question is, are you going to let them win?" Clara thought about Meridian Financial, about the compliance reports that had been ignored, about the people who'd lost everything because others had looked away. She thought about that billing flag on her screen, clear and unmistakable, designed specifically to catch what Evelyn Cross was doing. No, Clara said quietly. I'm not going to let them win. Good. Then we need to meet in person. Today if possible. Because if we're doing this, we're going to do it right. Clara agreed to meet at Sarah's office that afternoon. After hanging up, she sat on her couch staring at the lawsuit notice. She just declared war on one of the most powerful women in the city. A woman who destroyed careers with a phone call. A woman who had unlimited resources and no concept of mercy. Clara had a compliance background, a lawyer she'd just met, and a memory of a billing flag that might mean everything or might mean nothing. But she also had something Evelyn Cross had lost years ago, the willingness to stand by the truth even when it cost everything. That evening, as Clara prepared for her meeting with Sarah Chun, a sealed report landed on a desk at the Securities and Exchange Commission. The analyst who received it was named Jennifer Wade, a 15-year veteran who'd built her reputation on finding patterns others missed. Jennifer opened the report and began reading about cross-tech investments, shell company structures, and a billing flag that had appeared at a restaurant during a private dinner. She read for 20 minutes, cross-referencing details against old case files. Then she picked up her phone and called her supervisor. I think we need to reopen the Meridian-related inquiries, Jennifer said. I'm seeing connections that were missed the first time. How strong are the connections? Jennifer looked at the report again, at the billing codes and routing structures that match patterns from 3 previous investigations. Strong enough to justify a formal inquiry. Someone's been hiding money in plain sight, and I think I know who. As the sun set on another day, 3 separate forces were moving toward collision. Evelyn Cross believed she could intimidate her way out of trouble. Clara Mitchell was preparing to fight back with truth as her only weapon. And somewhere in a federal building, investigators were opening files that had been closed too soon. The past was refusing to stay buried, and everyone involved was about to discover that some secrets have a weight of their own, one that eventually crushes everything built on top of them. Clara sat in Sarah Chen's office and signed her first formal statement as a potential witness in what might become a federal investigation. Her hand trembled slightly as she wrote her name, knowing that this signature changed everything. There was no going back now. The line had been crossed. Whatever happened next would reshape every life it touched. And somewhere in her glass tower, Evelyn Cross stood at her window, staring at the city below, unaware that the ground beneath her empire had already begun to shift. Clara's formal statement as a potential witness had set something irreversible in motion. Within 48 hours of signing that document in Sarah Chen's office, the carefully constructed walls around Evelyn Cross's empire began showing cracks that no amount of money or intimidation could repair. The news broke on a Wednesday morning, buried in the business section of the financial press. SEC freezes subsidiary account in routine compliance review. The article was brief, carefully worded to avoid suggesting wrongdoing, but anyone who understood how these things worked knew what it meant. The Securities and Exchange Commission didn't freeze accounts for routine reasons. They froze accounts when they found something worth investigating. The subsidiary in question was Crosstech Investments, one of dozens of corporate entities in Evelyn Cross's business empire. To casual observers, it looked like a minor administrative matter. But to the people who moved in Evelyn's circles, it was a signal fire. At Crosstech Industries headquarters, panic spread like a virus. Senior executives gathered in emergency meetings, their voices low and urgent. The company's chief financial officer, a man named David Preston, stood before a whiteboard covered in diagrams of corporate structures and fund flows, trying to explain to increasingly nervous board members why a frozen account shouldn't concern them. It's a single subsidiary, David said, his voice steady despite the sweat on his forehead. We have proper documentation for every transaction. This is likely just a procedural review triggered by updated reporting thresholds. It happens. Does Evelyn know? Asked Margaret Foster, the longest-serving board member and one of the few people who occasionally questioned Evelyn's decisions. She's been informed. And what did she say? David hesitated. She said to cooperate fully with any inquiries and to continue business as usual. Business as usual. Margaret's laugh was bitter. When the SEC freezes an account, there is no business as usual. There's before the freeze and after the freeze. And everything after is damage control. She wasn't wrong. By noon, 3 major investors had called requesting meetings to discuss portfolio strategy. By 3 o'clock, 2 junior executives had quietly hired personal attorneys. By close of business, the company's stock had dropped 4% on heavier than normal trading volume. The markets could smell blood in the water. In her office, Evelyn stood at her window, her phone pressed to her ear. She'd been making calls for 6 hours straight, reassuring investors, demanding answers from her legal team, trying to control a situation that seemed determined to spiral beyond her reach. "I want to know exactly who triggered this investigation," she said to Marcus Reed, her voice cold with fury. Someone provided information to the SEC. Someone pointed them toward Crosstech specifically. "We're looking into it," Marcus replied. "But Evelyn, you need to understand what's happening here. The SEC doesn't move on rumors. They move on documentation. Someone gave them something concrete. The waitress? Possibly. Or someone who heard about the restaurant incident and started asking questions. Or someone from inside your own organization. The point is, they have enough to justify freezing assets. That means they believe there's a legitimate concern about fund movement or dissipation of evidence." Evelyn's jaw clenched. "Everything I've done is legal. The structures were designed by the best attorneys in the country. There's nothing for them to find. Then we have nothing to worry about," Marcus said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But I need you to prepare for the possibility that this becomes public in a bigger way. The financial press has already picked up the story. If it spreads to mainstream media, the narrative becomes harder to control." After hanging up, Evelyn turned from the window and swept her arm across her desk, sending papers, pens, and a crystal award crashing to the floor. The sound was satisfying, but it did nothing to ease the rage burning in her chest. That waitress, that insignificant nobody who should have been invisible, she'd done this. She'd seen one billing flag, and instead of ignoring it like any sensible person would have, she'd made it a crusade. Evelyn's assistant, Jennifer, appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral despite the mess on the floor. "Miss Cross, there's someone here to see you. He says it's urgent. I'm not taking meetings. He says his name is Philip Donnelly. He worked for you 3 years ago." Evelyn's blood went cold. Philip Donnelly had been her director of financial operations until she'd fired him for asking too many questions about certain transactions. She'd made him sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and paid him enough to ensure his silence. "Send him in," Evelyn said quietly. Philip entered like a man who knew he held a winning hand. He was in his 40s, still professional in appearance, but there was something different about him now, a confidence that came from having nothing left to lose. "Evelyn," he said, not bothering with pleasantries, "I heard about the SEC investigation. I thought we should talk. You signed an NDA." "I did, and I honored it for 3 years. But NDAs have limits. They can't be used to cover up illegal activity. And more importantly, they don't protect you from federal subpoenas." Evelyn's expression remained perfectly controlled, but inside, fear bloomed. "What do you want, Philip? I want you to understand your position. The SEC has already contacted me. They're asking questions about financial structures I helped implement when I worked here. Structures that, at the time, you assured me were completely legitimate." "They were legitimate. Were they?" Philip pulled out his phone and held it up. "I kept copies, Evelyn. Emails, memos, transaction records. Everything you told me to destroy, I saved. Not because I planned to use them, but because I wanted insurance in case you ever try to blame me for your decisions. You're violating your NDA. Swim. I'll be in federal custody providing testimony by the time your lawyers draft the paperwork." Philip's voice hardened. "You built an empire on making people afraid of you. But here's what you never understood. Eventually, people get more afraid of prison than they are of you. And when that happens, all your power means nothing. What do you want?" Evelyn repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing. I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to tell you that I'm cooperating with federal investigators. I'm providing documentation of every questionable transaction I was involved with during my employment. And I'm testifying under oath About conversations where you explicitly instructed me to structure deals in ways that would avoid regulatory scrutiny. That's not illegal. Tax efficiency is. Tax efficiency is one thing. What we did was something else. You know it, I know it, and soon a jury will know it. Philip turned toward the door, then paused. You should have left that waitress alone, Evelyn. She saw one flag. She reported what she saw. That should have been the end of it. But you had to destroy her. You had to make an example. And in doing that, you made people like me realize that we had a choice. Keep being afraid of you, or start being afraid of what happens if we stay silent. He left without another word. Evelyn stood frozen, her mind racing through scenarios and consequences. Philip's testimony would be devastating. He'd been present for discussions that, without context, could look damning. With the right prosecutor spinning the narrative, legitimate business practices could be reframed as criminal conspiracy. She picked up her phone and dialed Marcus Reed again. "We have a problem," she said when he answered. "Philip Donnelly is cooperating with the SEC. The silence on the other end told her everything she needed to know. Across town, Clara sat in a small conference room at the SEC's field office. Across from her sat Jennifer Wade, the analyst who'd reopened the investigation, along with a federal prosecutor named Robert Hayes. Sarah Chun sat beside Clara, reviewing documents and occasionally whispering advice. "Ms. Mitchell," Robert Hayes began, his voice professional but not unkind. "Thank you for coming in voluntarily. As we discussed, you're not under investigation. You're here as a witness to help us understand certain financial structures." Clara nodded, her mouth dry despite the water bottle in front of her. "I want to walk through what you saw at the restaurant that night. Specifically, the billing flag that appeared on your terminal. Can you describe it in as much detail as possible?" Clara took a breath and began explaining. She described the automatic tag, the corporate routing notification, the specific codes that had triggered her recognition. She explained her background at Meridian Financial, her experience with compliance systems, and why she'd understood immediately that the flag wasn't random. Jennifer Wade took notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Her expertise was obvious. She knew exactly which details mattered and which were peripheral. "The routing structure you described," Jennifer said, pulling up a document on her laptop. "Does this look familiar?" Clara leaned forward, studying the screen. It showed a complex diagram of corporate entities, funds flowing between them in carefully orchestrated patterns. And there, highlighted in yellow, were the same codes she'd seen on the restaurant billing system. "Yes," Clara said. "That's exactly it. The tag appears when transactions route through shell companies designed to obscure the actual source or destination of funds. And you're certain the system wasn't malfunctioning? That the flag was accurate? The system was working exactly as designed. Those flags are built into the software specifically to catch these patterns. They can't be accidentally triggered. The account structure has to match specific criteria that indicate potential regulatory violations." Robert Hayes exchanged a glance with Jennifer Wade. "Ms. Mitchell, what I'm about to tell you is confidential. You cannot share this information with anyone outside this room, including friends or family. Do you understand?" Clara nodded. "We've connected your billing flag to at least 3 separate shell entities controlled by Evelyn Cross. Those entities have been used to reroute funds in ways that appear designed to avoid reporting thresholds. We're talking about millions of dollars moved through structures that serve no legitimate business purpose except to obscure the money trail." Clara felt her stomach drop. "So it wasn't just one dinner charge. The whole system was flagged." "Correct. Your refusal to override that flag created documentation that we were able to trace backward through the corporate structure. Without that documentation, we might never have noticed the pattern." Robert leaned forward. "Ms. Mitchell, I need you to understand what this means. Your testimony isn't just helpful. It may be essential to our case. You're the person who first identified the flag. You're the person who refused to make it disappear. That makes you a critical witness. But I didn't investigate anything. I just processed a bill. You processed a bill correctly, despite enormous pressure to do otherwise. That takes courage, and it creates a paper trail that investigators can follow." He paused. I also need you to understand the implications. When this becomes public, and it will become public, your name will be associated with this case. Evelyn Cross has significant resources and a reputation for destroying people who cross her. We can offer some protections, but we can't guarantee your life won't be disrupted. Sarah Chun spoke up, which is why we need to discuss whistleblower protections formally. Clara isn't just a witness. She reported suspected financial impropriety despite personal and professional risk. That qualifies her for legal protections and potentially for compensation if the government recovers funds. Agreed, Roberts said. We'll start that paperwork today. The meeting continued for another 2 hours. Clara walked through every detail she could remember, answered questions about her compliance training at Meridian, and reviewed documents that showed how the restaurant's billing system connected to larger investigative threads. When she finally left the building, it was late afternoon. Sarah Chun walked with her to the parking garage. You did well in there, Sarah said. You were clear, consistent, and credible. That's exactly what prosecutors need. I feel like I'm drowning, Clara admitted. 3 weeks ago, I was just serving tables. Now I'm testifying about financial fraud to federal prosecutors. I know it's overwhelming, but Clara, you need to understand something. What you did, refusing to delete that flag, that wasn't a small thing. You saw evidence of potential wrongdoing, and you didn't look away. Most people would have. Most people do. The fact that you didn't makes you either very brave or very stubborn. I'm not brave. I'm terrified. Good. That means you understand what you're up against. Sarah stopped beside her car. Evelyn Cross is going to come after you harder now. The lawsuit was just the beginning. She's going to try to discredit you, intimidate you, maybe even threaten you directly. You need to be prepared for that. Clara nodded, though her hands were shaking. What happens next? The investigation accelerates. They'll interview more witnesses, subpoena documents, build the case. It could take months, maybe longer. During that time, you need to keep your head down and avoid anything that could be used against you. Like what? Like talking to media, like posting anything on social media, like doing anything that Evelyn's attorneys could twist into looking unprofessional or vindictive. Sarah's expression softened. I know that's a lot to ask, but this is how these cases work. The government builds slowly and carefully. We just need to be patient. Clara drove home in a daze, her mind spinning with everything she'd learned. The billing flag she'd seen hadn't been a glitch or an overreaction. It had been accurate. Evelyn Cross had been using her corporate structures to hide money, to avoid scrutiny, to operate above the rules that governed everyone else. And Clara had caught her. The realization was both empowering and terrifying. That evening, Clara's phone rang. The number was blocked. Hello, she answered cautiously. Ms. Mitchell. The voice was smooth, professional male. My name is Daniel Foster. I'm an attorney representing several parties who might be affected by the current SEC investigation into cross-tech entities. I can't talk about that. I understand, but I'm not calling about the investigation directly. I'm calling to offer you an opportunity. My clients are prepared to provide you with financial assistance. Let's call it $200,000, in exchange for a signed statement clarifying that you may have misunderstood what you saw on the restaurant billing system. Clara's blood went cold. That's a bribe. It's compensation for your time and trouble. A settlement, if you will. You've been put in a difficult position through no fault of your own. This would allow you to move on with your life without the stress of a prolonged legal matter. I'm hanging up now. Ms. Mitchell, please think carefully. $200,000 is life-changing money for someone in your position. It could pay off debts, allow you to go back to school, start over somewhere new. All we're asking is that you acknowledge the possibility of a mistake. There was no mistake. The flag was accurate. I know it was accurate because I understand the systems. Are you certain? Because uncertainty is reasonable. You saw something complex for a few seconds during a stressful situation. Perhaps you misremembered. Clara ended the call, her heart pounding. She immediately called Sarah Chun. Someone just tried to bribe me, Clara said, her voice shaking. They offered me $200,000 to recant my statement. Sarah's response was immediate. Did you record the call? No, I didn't think. That's okay. Write down everything you remember. Exact words, if possible. Time of call, name they gave you, everything. This is witness tampering. It's a federal crime. The prosecutors need to know about this immediately. Clara spent the next hour documenting the conversation in painful detail. When she finished, she emailed the document to Sarah and copied Robert Hayes at the SEC. The response came within minutes. File received. This is being taken seriously. Do not answer calls from unknown numbers. If they contact you again, document, but do not engage. Clara set down her phone and looked around her small apartment. 3 weeks ago, this had been her quiet life. Work, bills, simple routines. Now she was at the center of a federal investigation, being offered bribes, receiving threats through lawyers, preparing to testify against one of the most powerful women in the country. She thought about backing out, about calling Sarah and saying she'd made a mistake, that she wanted to withdraw her statement, that she just wanted her normal life back. But then she thought about Meridian Financial, about all the people who'd lost their jobs because executives had moved money illegally and no one had stopped them, about the compliance reports that had been ignored, the warnings that had been dismissed, the patterns that had been hidden until it was too late. She thought about Philip Donnelly, walking into Evelyn's office to announce his cooperation with investigators, about all the people who'd been intimidated into silence, who'd watched wrongdoing happen and said nothing because they were afraid. Clara had been afraid too. She was still afraid, but fear wasn't enough to make her lie. The next day, news of the investigation leaked to the mainstream media. The headlines were cautious but damaging. Billionaire CEO under federal scrutiny. SEC expands investigation into corporate shell companies. Former employees cooperate in financial probe. Evelyn's name wasn't mentioned directly in the initial reports, but anyone paying attention knew exactly who they were talking about. Within hours, the story had spread across financial news networks, business blogs, and social media. At Crosstech headquarters, the board of directors held an emergency meeting. This time, Evelyn wasn't invited. Margaret Foster stood at the head of the conference table, her expression grim. We need to discuss the company's exposure in light of the SEC investigation. Our fiduciary responsibility is to shareholders, not to protecting Evelyn's personal interests. David Preston, the CFO, nodded. I've reviewed our corporate structures with outside counsel. The good news is that most of our operations are completely separate from the entities under investigation. The bad news is that separation may not matter to public perception. What are you suggesting? Another board member asked. I'm suggesting we consider asking Evelyn to step down as CEO while the investigation is ongoing. We can frame it as a voluntary decision to avoid distraction from company operations. But the reality is, her presence is becoming a liability. The room fell silent. Asking Evelyn Cross to step down was unthinkable. She'd built this company from nothing. She was the company in every way that mattered. But she was also under federal investigation. And boards had a way of prioritizing survival over loyalty when the stakes got high enough. Let's table that discussion for now, Margaret said carefully. But start preparing options. We may need to move quickly if the situation deteriorates. For Evelyn, sitting alone in her penthouse that evening, the deterioration was already obvious. Her phone had stopped ringing with investor calls. Meetings were being postponed indefinitely. Board members were suddenly unavailable. Even Jennifer, her loyal assistant for 8 years, had seemed nervous that morning. Evelyn had spent her entire adult life building an empire based on fear and respect. She'd never allowed weakness, never tolerated failure, never accepted anything less than absolute control. But control was an illusion. She just never realized it before. The empire she'd built wasn't held together by her strength. It was held together by everyone's belief in her strength. And that belief, once cracked, was impossible to repair. A waitress had cracked it, a nobody with a background in compliance who'd refused to look away from one billing flag. One small act of defiance had exposed the foundation, and now everything built on top of it was beginning to crumble. Evelyn stood at her window, looking out at the city she'd once dominated. Somewhere down there, Clara Mitchell was probably terrified, probably wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. But she'd stood her ground. She'd told the truth despite every threat, every pressure, every inducement to do otherwise. And that truth had weight. It had momentum. It had the power to destroy everything Evelyn had spent decades building. For the first time in her life, Evelyn Cross understood what it meant to be afraid of someone with nothing to lose. Clara's phone buzzed with another news alert. The investigation was expanding. More former employees were coming forward. Financial records were being subpoenaed. The SEC had issued a formal statement confirming they were pursuing multiple leads related to corporate financial structures and potential fraud. She turned off her phone and sat in silence, trying to process everything that had happened. She'd done what she thought was right. She'd refused to make a billing flag disappear. She'd told the truth to investigators. But the consequences were vast and spreading. People were losing jobs. A company was facing collapse. A billionaire's empire was crumbling. Clara wondered if she should feel guilty, if the destruction she'd triggered was justified by the wrongdoing she'd exposed. Sarah Chun had told her something during their first meeting. The truth doesn't care about convenience. It doesn't care about who gets hurt or whose life gets disrupted. It just is. And once it's out, you can't put it back. Clara was beginning to understand what that meant. The truth about Evelyn Cross's financial structures had always existed. It had been there in transaction records, in corporate filings, in the architecture of shell companies designed to obscure reality. But it had been hidden, ignored, accepted because challenging it seemed too difficult or too dangerous. Until one waitress refused to delete a billing flag. Now the truth was loose. And like water finding every crack in a dam, it was spreading into every corner of Evelyn's empire, exposing what had always been there, but never acknowledged. Clara didn't know if she was brave or foolish. She didn't know if history would remember her as a whistleblower or as the person who destroyed thousands of jobs and billions in shareholder value. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She could look at herself in a mirror. She'd seen evidence of wrongdoing, and she hadn't looked away. She'd been pressured to stay silent, and she'd refused. Whatever came next, she'd face it with her integrity intact. And in a world that often rewarded looking the other way, that felt like something worth protecting, the indictment came down on a gray Tuesday morning in March, 6 months after that dinner at the Sterling Room. Clara was at work when she heard the news, not from prosecutors or from Sarah Chun, but from a customer who was watching the breaking news on his phone at the bar. "Holy shit," the man muttered. "They actually indicted her." Clara's hands went still on the wine glass she was polishing. She didn't need to ask who. There was only one her that mattered anymore. Evelyn Cross had been formally charged with 15 counts of financial fraud, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to defraud the United States. The indictment was 53 pages long and detailed a decade of carefully constructed schemes designed to hide income, avoid taxes, and manipulate financial reporting. The news spread through the restaurant like wildfire. Servers gathered around phones, reading headlines aloud. Even Gerald, who'd spent months trying to distance the restaurant from the scandal, couldn't hide his shock. Clara excused herself and stepped into the back hallway, her heart pounding. She pulled out her phone and found 17 missed calls from Sarah Chun. She called back immediately. "You've seen the news," Sarah said without preamble. "Just now. The trial is set for 6 months from now. The prosecution is moving fast because they have overwhelming documentation. Philip Donnelly's testimony, the billing records, transaction histories, emails, it's all there." Sarah paused. "Clara, you're listed as a primary witness. Your name is in the indictment. As of about an hour ago, you're officially public." Clara closed her eyes, leaning against the cold concrete wall. She'd known this was coming. She prepared for it. But knowing and experiencing were two very different things. What does that mean for me? It means media attention. It means reporters might try to contact you. It means your face and name will be associated with this case forever. Sarah's voice became firm. "Do not talk to anyone. No interviews, no comments, nothing. Refer all media requests to me. The prosecution has very specific guidelines about witness communication during trial preparation." "Okay. Clara, listen to me. This is going to be hard. Evelyn's defense team will try to destroy your credibility. They'll dig into your past, question your motives, make you look vindictive or incompetent or both. You need to be prepared for that. I am prepared. I hope so, because this trial is going to be brutal. The next 6 months passed in a blur of preparation, anxiety, and unwanted attention. True to Sarah's warning, reporters found Clara within days of the indictment. They showed up at the Sterling room, at her apartment, even at the grocery store. Camera crews waited outside, hoping for a comment, a reaction, anything they could use. Clara said nothing. She walked past them with her head down, went to work, came home, and tried to maintain some semblance of normal life while the world dissected everything she'd done. The media coverage was relentless. News outlets ran profiles on both women. Evelyn, the fallen billionaire who'd built an empire on fear and manipulation. Clara, the whistleblower waitress who'd brought it all down with one refused deletion. Some stories painted Clara as heroic. Others questioned her motives, suggested she'd acted out of spite or ambition, implied she'd manufactured the crisis for attention. Clara stopped reading the news. It didn't matter what strangers thought. What mattered was the truth, and she knew what that was. The prosecution team met with her regularly, walking through her testimony over and over until she could recite every detail in her sleep. Robert Hayes, the federal prosecutor leading the case, was methodical and patient, anticipating every angle the defense might use. "They're going to say you misunderstood the billing system," he told her during one preparation session. "They're going to suggest you were inexperienced, that you saw something suspicious because you wanted to see it, not because it was actually there." "But the flag was real," Clara said. "The system generated it automatically based on the account structure." "I know, and we have documentation proving that. But juries don't always understand technical details. They understand stories. And Evelyn's attorneys are excellent storytellers." Robert leaned forward. "Your strength as a witness is your consistency and your expertise. You worked in compliance. You understand these systems. You recognize the pattern because you'd seen it before. That's our narrative. Don't let them shake you from it." Clara nodded, committing the advice to memory. Evelyn, meanwhile, had assembled the most expensive legal team money could buy. Her lead attorney was a woman named Patricia Lawson, famous for winning impossible cases through sheer aggression and brilliance. Patricia was 62, with silver hair and the kind of courtroom presence that made witnesses reconsider their certainty. She'd already filed dozens of pre-trial motions, challenging evidence, questioning witnesses, demanding dismissals. Every motion was denied, but that wasn't really the point. The point was to create doubt, to bog down the prosecution and procedure, to demonstrate that Evelyn wouldn't go down without a fight. The trial began on a Monday in September, almost exactly 1 year after that dinner at the Sterling room. The courthouse was surrounded by media trucks, protesters, and curious onlookers. Inside, the courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, and people who'd simply managed to get seats for what was being called the trial of the decade. Clara sat in the witness waiting room, her stomach churning with nerves. She wore a simple navy suit that Sarah had helped her pick out, professional but not expensive, approachable but not casual. Everything about her appearance had been carefully calibrated to present the right image. Honest, competent, credible. Through the closed door, she could hear muffled voices as the proceedings began. Opening arguments would take most of the day. Clara wasn't scheduled to testify until later in the week, but the prosecution had wanted her present from the beginning, to see how the trial unfolded, to understand the atmosphere she'd be walking into. Robert Hayes's opening argument was devastating. He laid out the case methodically, explaining how Evelyn had constructed an elaborate network of shell companies designed to hide income and avoid taxes. He showed transaction records, emails, testimony from cooperating witnesses. He painted a picture of systematic fraud spanning more than a decade. "This isn't a case about aggressive tax strategy," Robert told the jury. "This isn't about sophisticated business planning. This is about deliberate deception, about creating false records, destroying evidence, and intimidating anyone who questioned scheme. And it all came to light because one person, a restaurant server with a background in financial compliance, saw a billing flag and refused to make it disappear." Patricia Lawson's opening was equally powerful, but took a completely different approach. She didn't deny that Evelyn's corporate structures were complex. Instead, She embraced that complexity, arguing it was perfectly legal and standard practice for high-net-worth individuals. Evelyn Cross is being prosecuted for being successful, Patricia told the jury, her voice ringing with conviction, for using the same tax strategies that every major corporation and wealthy individual uses. The prosecution wants you to believe that complexity equals criminality. But the tax code is complex. Corporate law is complex. And navigating that complexity legally is not a crime. It's smart business. She then turned her attention to Clara, though Clara wasn't yet in the courtroom. You're going to hear from a woman named Clara Mitchell. She's going to tell you she saw something suspicious on a computer screen. She's going to claim she recognized patterns of fraud. But what she won't tell you is that she was fired from her previous job at a company that collapsed due to mismanagement. She won't tell you that she had every reason to be hypersensitive to anything that looked irregular, even when it wasn't. She won't tell you that she may have seen what she wanted to see, a chance to be important, to be relevant, to transform from a waitress into a whistleblower. Clara, watching on the monitor in the witness room, felt her face burn. None of that was true. She hadn't been fired from Meridian. The entire company had been dissolved. She hadn't wanted to be important. She just wanted to do her job correctly. But Patricia's words planted seeds of doubt. That was the game. Not truth, but reasonable doubt. The trial proceeded with methodical precision. The prosecution called witness after witness. Accountants who explained the shell company structures, FBI agents who detailed the investigation, former Crosstech employees who testified about Evelyn's explicit instructions to obscure transactions. Philip Donnelly was particularly damaging. He spent 2 full days on the stand, walking the jury through internal emails, strategy meetings, and direct conversations where Evelyn had explained exactly how to route funds to avoid regulatory scrutiny. She told me the structures were legal. Philip testified, his voice steady. She said her attorneys had approved everything. But she also told me that the less documentation we created, the better. That certain conversations should never happen over email. That if anyone asked questions, we should bury them in complexity until they gave up. Patricia Lawson tried to shake him during cross-examination, but Philip had documentation for everything. Emails, memos, recorded phone calls. He'd kept copies of it all, and the prosecution had spent months verifying every piece. You betrayed your employer, Patricia accused. You violated your non-disclosure agreement. You're testifying to save yourself from prosecution, aren't you? I'm testifying because what we did was wrong, Philip replied calmly. And yes, I got immunity in exchange for cooperation. But that doesn't change the facts. Those emails are real. Those transactions happened. Evelyn Cross personally designed these structures to hide income. I know because I was in the room when she explained how to do it. By the time Clara was called to testify, the prosecution had already built a comprehensive case. But Clara's testimony was critical because she was the beginning, the person who'd first flagged the system, who'd refused to ignore what she'd seen. Clara walked into the courtroom on a Thursday morning, her legs steadier than she'd expected. The room was smaller than it had looked on the monitor, more intimate. Evelyn sat at the defense table in a perfectly tailored suit, her expression neutral, her posture perfect. But when Clara glanced at her, she saw something new in Evelyn's eyes, fear masked as contempt. Clara raised her right hand and swore to tell the truth. Then she sat in the witness box and focused on Robert Hayes, blocking out everything else. Ms. Mitchell, Robert began, can you tell the jury about your educational background and work experience? Clara explained her compliance training, her work at Meridian Financial, her understanding of billing systems and fraud detection protocols. She spoke clearly, avoiding jargon, making the technical concepts accessible. On the night of September 15th of last year, you were working at the Sterling Room restaurant. Can you describe what happened? Clara walked through the evening, Evelyn's arrival, the tense atmosphere, the moment the billing flag appeared on her screen. She explained what the flag meant, why it had triggered, and what it indicated about the account structure. Did you consider deleting the flag? Robert asked. No, the system is designed to prevent manual overrides for exactly this reason. The flag was there because the transaction matched patterns associated with financial irregularities. Deleting it would have violated protocol and potentially made me complicit in hiding suspicious activity. What happened when you presented the bill? Clara described Evelyn's reaction. The anger, the threats, the public confrontation. She explained how Evelyn had demanded the charge be removed, how she'd promised to destroy Clara's career if she didn't comply. I told her I couldn't override the system without creating an audit trail, Clara said. She became more angry. She told me I had no idea who I was dealing with, that she could end my career with one phone call. Were you afraid? Yes. Everyone at the restaurant was afraid of her. But I was more afraid of ignoring something that might be important. I worked at a company that collapsed because people ignored warnings. I didn't want to be part of that again. Robert nodded, satisfied. No further questions. Patricia Lawson rose for cross-examination like a predator approaching prey. Her smile was sharp, professional, dangerous. Ms. Mitchell, you testified that you worked at Meridian Financial. That company was shut down due to fraud, correct? It was dissolved after a federal investigation, yes. And you lost your job when that happened. Everyone lost their jobs. The entire company was closed. But you specifically worked in compliance, the department responsible for catching the fraud that destroyed the company. Isn't that ironic? Clara kept her voice steady. I was junior staff. I reported irregularities when I saw them. What senior management did with those reports wasn't within my control. So you reported irregularities at Meridian, and the company collapsed. Then you reported irregularities about my client, and you're trying to make her company collapse. Do you see a pattern, Ms. Mitchell? The pattern I see is people hiding financial misconduct until someone forces them to stop. Patricia's eyes narrowed. You're not a licensed accountant, are you? No. You're not a certified fraud examiner. No. You're not a financial analyst or an attorney. No. But I have training and experience. You're a waitress, Patricia interrupted. A waitress who saw something on a computer screen for a few seconds and decided you understood complex corporate tax structures better than my client's team of attorneys and accountants who've spent decades in this field. I understand billing flags, Clara said firmly. I know what they mean and why they trigger. The flag appeared because your client's account matched patterns associated with fraud. That's not my opinion. That's how the system works. Or perhaps the system malfunctioned. Perhaps you misread it. Perhaps you were so eager to find something wrong, to be important again after losing your job at Meridian, that you saw what you wanted to see. The billing flag was documented, Clara said, her voice rising slightly. The prosecution has screenshots, system logs, everything. It's not my interpretation. It's objective data. Patricia switched tactics. You've received quite a bit of attention since this case began, haven't you? Media coverage, interviews. I've declined all interview requests. But you're aware people are calling you a hero. A whistleblower who brought down a corrupt billionaire. That must feel gratifying after years of being, as you said, just junior staff. I didn't do this for attention. I did it because it was right. Right? Patricia repeated, her tone dripping with skepticism. Ms. Mitchell, isn't it true that you're seeking compensation as a whistleblower? That if my client is convicted, you stand to receive potentially millions of dollars? Sarah Chun had prepared Clara for this question. It was technically true that whistleblowers could receive compensation from recovered funds, but Clara hadn't initiated the case for that reason. I'm eligible for whistleblower protections under federal law, Clara said carefully. But I reported what I saw because it was the correct thing to do, not because of potential compensation. Patricia smiled coldly. How convenient that doing the right thing might also make you rich. Objection. Robert Hayes stood. Argumentative and misleading. Sustained, the judge said. Ms. Lawson, move on. Patricia asked more questions, probing for inconsistencies, trying to shake Clara's confidence. But Clara had spent 6 months preparing. She knew her testimony inside and out. She didn't waver, didn't contradict herself, didn't get flustered. After 90 minutes, Patricia gave up. No further questions. Clara was excused. As she walked past the defense table, Evelyn's eyes met hers for just a moment. In that brief glance, Clara saw something that almost looked like respect. an acknowledgement that Clara had stood her ground, that she'd been tested and hadn't broken. Then it was gone, replaced by Evelyn's usual mask of cold superiority. The trial continued for 3 more weeks. Expert witnesses explained the financial structures in excruciating detail. Forensic accountants showed how money had moved through the shell companies. Former business partners testified about conversations where Evelyn had explicitly discussed avoiding regulatory oversight. Evelyn herself took the stand in her own defense, a calculated risk. She was polished, professional, unshakable. She explained every transaction as legitimate tax planning, every structure as standard practice, every decision as backed by legal counsel. "I built my company through hard work and smart strategy," Evelyn testified. "Everything I did was reviewed by attorneys and accountants. If mistakes were made, they were honest mistakes of interpretation, not criminal intent." But under Robert Hayes's cross-examination, cracks appeared. He produced email after email where Evelyn had instructed employees to destroy documents, to avoid written communication about certain transactions, to create false paper trails. "If everything was legal," Robert asked, "why did you order these documents destroyed?" Standard document retention policy. Except these emails specifically mentioned destroying records before potential audits. That's not document retention. That's obstruction. Evelyn's composure slipped for just a moment, a flash of anger, quickly controlled. But the jury saw it. Closing arguments were dramatic and exhausting. Robert Hayes methodically reviewed every piece of evidence, connecting dots, showing patterns, demonstrating beyond reasonable doubt that Evelyn had knowingly and deliberately committed fraud. Patricia Lawson countered with passion and fury, arguing that complexity wasn't criminality, that aggressive tax planning wasn't illegal, that the prosecution was criminalizing success because they couldn't understand it. "They want you to convict Evelyn Cross for being smart," Patricia told the jury, "for using strategies that are perfectly legal but that they find distasteful. Don't let them do that. Don't let them turn success into a crime." The jury deliberated for 4 days. For days of waiting, of second-guessing, of wondering if 12 strangers would see the truth or be swayed by Patricia's alternative narrative. Clara wasn't present for the verdict. She was at home, trying and failing to distract herself, when Sarah Chin called. "It's happening," Sarah said. "The jury's coming back. Can you get to the courthouse?" Clara made it in 20 minutes, slipping into the public gallery just as the jury filed in. She'd learned to read jury body language during the trial. 12 people who'd spent weeks examining evidence, who now held Evelyn's fate in their hands. They didn't look at the defense table. That was a bad sign for Evelyn. The judge asked for the verdict. The jury foreman stood. "On count 1, financial fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On count 2, money laundering, we find the defendant guilty. On count 3, it continued for all 15 counts. Guilty on every single one." The courtroom erupted in controlled chaos. Reporters scrambling for doors, spectators whispering, attorneys conferring urgently. Evelyn sat perfectly still, her face a mask, but Clara saw her hands gripping the table edge, knuckles white. Sentencing was set for 6 weeks later. Evelyn was allowed to remain free on bond, but the verdict was clear. She would be going to prison. Clara left the courthouse before the media could find her. She sat in her car in the parking garage for a long time, processing what had just happened. Evelyn Cross had been convicted. The woman who'd terrified everyone, who'd built an empire on fear and power, who'd threatened to destroy Clara's life. She'd been found guilty by a jury of her peers. Clara expected to feel triumphant. Instead, she felt exhausted and strangely sad. Sentencing day arrived on a cold morning in November. The judge, a stern woman named Catherine Reynolds, reviewed the case thoroughly before pronouncing sentence. "Ms. Cross, you were a person of extraordinary privilege and opportunity. You built a successful business empire. You had wealth, influence, and respect. But instead of using those advantages responsibly, you chose to commit systematic fraud over more than a decade. You hid income, manipulated records, and destroyed evidence. And when someone tried to expose your crimes, You attempted to destroy their life. Judge Reynolds paused, her expression severe. This court takes white-collar crime seriously. The harm you cause extends beyond tax evasion. You undermined faith in legitimate business practices. You intimidated employees into complicity. You used your power as a weapon against anyone who questioned you. She announced the sentence: 22 years in federal prison, with eligibility for parole after serving 18 years. Additionally, Evelyn was ordered to pay $847 million in restitution, fines, and penalties. Evelyn's face remained composed, but Clara saw her shoulders sag slightly, the first real sign that she understood her world had ended. Federal marshals led Evelyn away in handcuffs. The woman who'd never been told no, who'd controlled every aspect of her environment, who'd inspired fear with a glance. She walked out of the courtroom in chains. The aftermath unfolded over the following months. Crosstech Industries was restructured under new management. The board paid out settlements to victims who'd been harmed by Evelyn's schemes. Some executives faced their own criminal charges. The entire corporate structure was dismantled and rebuilt with proper oversight. Former employees who'd lost jobs or been intimidated began receiving restitution payments. People who'd been blacklisted found their careers restored. The restaurant that had nearly been destroyed by Evelyn's threats saw business actually improve, becoming famous as the place where the empire started crumbling. Clara received her whistleblower compensation, a percentage of the recovered funds. The amount was substantial, enough to change her life fundamentally. She could have retired, moved away, started over somewhere new where nobody knew her name. Instead, she used the money to go back to school. She enrolled in a forensic accounting program, determined to turn her accidental expertise into something formal and useful. If she was going to be known as the whistleblower who brought down a billionaire, she might as well become the expert everyone assumed she already was. She declined book deals, movie offers, and countless interview requests. She wasn't interested in being famous or celebrated. She'd done what needed to be done, and now she wanted to move on. The Sterling Room quietly changed management after Gerald retired, unable to handle the stress of the trial and media attention. The new owner, understanding the restaurant's unique history, kept a small framed photo behind the bar, not of Clara, but of the billing receipt with the flag that had started everything. A reminder that details matter, that systems exist for a reason, that sometimes the smallest acts of integrity have the largest consequences. Clara graduated with her forensic accounting degree 18 months after the trial ended. She took a job with a firm that specialized in investigating corporate fraud, working alongside the kinds of analysts who'd helped build the case against Evelyn. On her first day, her supervisor introduced her to the team. "This is Clara Mitchell," he said. "Some of you might recognize the name. She's the one who caught the Crosstech fraud before it was even an investigation." She saw a billing flag and refused to ignore it, even when one of the most powerful people in the country tried to destroy her for it. The team welcomed her warmly, treating her not as a curiosity or celebrity, but as a colleague who understood what they did and why it mattered. Clara settled into her new career, analyzing financial records, flagging suspicious patterns, helping build cases against people who believed they were above scrutiny. The work was demanding but satisfying. Every case she worked represented someone being held accountable, some victim getting justice, some wrong being corrected. She thought about Evelyn sometimes, imprisoned in a federal facility, stripped of everything she'd built, facing decades behind bars. Clara didn't take pleasure in that outcome, but she didn't regret it either. Evelyn had made choices. She'd broken laws. She hurt people. The consequences were severe, but deserved. And Clara had made her own choices. She'd seen something wrong and refused to look away. She'd been threatened, pressured, offered bribes, and publicly attacked. But she'd stood firm because the truth mattered more than her comfort. 3 years after that night at the Sterling Room, Clara was reviewing transaction records for a new case when she noticed a familiar pattern: corporate routing flags that indicated potential shell company manipulation. She flagged it immediately, documented everything, and submitted her findings to prosecutors. Another case was opened. Another investigation began. Another person with too much power would face accountability. Clara thought about how different her life had become. 3 years ago, she'd been a waitress trying to forget about compliance systems and failed companies. Now she was actively seeking out financial fraud, using her skills to catch people who thought they were untouchable. She thought about the moment she'd seen that billing flag appear on her screen, the split second where she'd had to choose between taking the easy path and doing what was right. That choice had cost her the quiet, anonymous life she'd built. But it had given her something more valuable, the knowledge that when tested, she hadn't looked away. Evelyn Cross had been the most powerful person Clara had ever encountered. She'd commanded billions, controlled corporations, inspired fear with her mere presence. She'd built an empire on the premise that power meant freedom from consequences. But power, it turned out, was fragile. It depended on everyone believing in it, on people being too afraid to question it, on systems being too weak to check it. One billing flag had shattered that illusion. One waitress refusing to delete documentation had exposed the foundation. And once exposed, the entire structure had collapsed under its own weight. Clara stood from her desk, stretching, looking around at her colleagues working on their own cases. Every person in this office had chosen, like her, to make truth more important than comfort, to hold the line against fraud and manipulation, to be the people who noticed when something was wrong and actually did something about it. It wasn't glamorous work. Most cases didn't make headlines. Most fraudsters weren't billionaires with dramatic courtroom trials. But every case mattered, every pattern flagged, every suspicious transaction documented, every small act of integrity that said, "You don't get to cheat just because you think you can." Clara returned to her work, analyzing numbers, looking for patterns, doing the quiet, unglamorous work of justice. Somewhere in a federal prison, Evelyn Cross was learning what life looked like without power protecting her. Learning that fear only worked as long as people were afraid. Learning that empires built on intimidation collapsed the moment someone refused to be intimidated. And somewhere in every city, in every restaurant, in every office, there were people facing their own moments of choice, seeing things that looked wrong, wondering whether to speak up or stay quiet, calculating the cost of honesty against the price of silence. Clara hoped they would choose to speak up, because she'd learned something in the 3 years since that night at the Sterling Room. The truth doesn't need to be loud or dramatic to matter. It just needs to be told. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to stand up and say, "No, I won't delete that. No, I won't ignore what I'm seeing. No, I won't make this disappear just because someone powerful wants me to." That's how empires fall. Not in dramatic confrontations or epic battles, but in quiet refusals, in small acts of integrity, in ordinary people deciding that truth matters more than comfort. Clara had been that ordinary person once, and now she helped others find the courage to do the same. The story that had started with a billing flag and a frightened waitress had become something larger, a reminder that power without accountability is temporary, that fear eventually fails, and that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply refuse to look away. That was enough. It would always be enough. When you see something wrong, will you have the courage to speak up even when it costs you everything? If you enjoyed this story of quiet integrity defeating unchecked power, like this video and subscribe for more stories that prove ordinary people can change the world.